Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second annual Racial Equity and Corporate Governance Virtual Conference. I'm George Brown, Executive Director of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, and we are delighted to be co-hosting this event today with the Institute for Law and Economics at University of Pennsylvania, the Ira M. Millstein Center for Global Markets and Corporate Ownership at Columbia Law School, and the Arthur and Toni Rembe Rock Center for Corporate Governance at Stanford University. We're going to have 3 sessions today to explore the latest ideas around board leadership on advancing racial equity. Our first panel will cover the role of public company boards in promoting racial equity and corporate governance, and I'll be the moderator for that panel. Then we'll have a fireside chat with Joseph Bay, co-CEO of KKR. And that panel will be moderated by Professor Lisa Fairfax of University of Pennsylvania. Our last panel will be moderated by Professor Kate Judge of Columbia Law School, and we'll discuss opening the door to private company boards and the different dynamics involved with non-public company boards seeking to advance racial equity. Now, let's begin with our first panel. The title of this panel is The Role of the Public Company Board in Promoting Racial Equity and Corporate Governance. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Let me first say that each of the panelists is speaking in their personal capacity, and none of us, including me, are giving legal advice. So first we have Maria Elena Mel Lagomasino, CEO of the We Family Offices. Mel has served on corporate boards for over 3 decades. She had a long career in banking, including serving as chair and CEO of JP Morgan Private Bank. She currently serves as lead independent director for the Coca-Cola Company board and is also a board member on the Walt Disney Company board of directors. She's received numerous accolades and recognition, including Woman of the Year by Hispanic Business Magazine, Top 25 Women in Finance by American Banker, and Directorship 100 by the National Association of Corporate Directors. Next, we have Ben Colton. Ben is Global Head of Asset Stewardship for State Street Global Advisors. Ben was a key participant in creating the recent publication on the board's oversight of racial and ethnic diversity, equity, and inclusion, published by Russell Reynolds Associates, State Street Global Advisors, and the Ford Foundation. We're going to be making available that report to all of the conference participants, and we'll post it on our websites as well. And then finally, we've got Barry Williams. Barry's an entrepreneur. He served on 14 public company boards. Barry's the retired managing general partner of Williams Pacific Ventures. Prior to that, he worked for McKinsey & Company in the United States and in several Latin American countries, and as managing principal for Bechtel Investments. Barry was formerly the lead independent director for a major public utility company, where he served as a board member for more than 25 years. Now, how this is going to work is we're looking for conversation, so I may pitch a question to an individual. I'm hoping each of the panelists will comment on the other's remarks. We're going to first have the main discussion, and then when we get near the end, we'll have some time for Q&A, and people can put questions in the Q&A function for Zoom, and we'll monitor those. They won't be seen by the participants, but we'll be monitoring them, and we'll pitch them to the panelists at the end. At 1:15 Eastern Time, we'll transition to the fireside chat. So let's get started. Let's start with the why question. So with respect to board oversight of company efforts regarding racial equity, first, should boards take responsibility for overall oversight of DEI and racial equity initiatives for the companies they oversee, and why? Mel, you want to start us off? You're on mute.
Sorry. So I think the board is responsible for the culture of the company, and a big part of the culture of the company is the sense of belonging and inclusion of a diverse population. And so I think the board has absolute responsibility to make sure that we are creating a racially and diverse, inclusive culture.
Okay. Barry, thoughts?
Well, from my perspective, I think diversity should be viewed as more than a response for social equity. I think it should be looked at as a business mandate, because I think diversity is key to developing and implementing a strategy that's going to be successful in the future. And because diversity is tied so much to strategy, I think it's definitely within the purview of the board.
Yeah, I mean, from a shareholder's perspective, State Street Global Advisors is a large asset manager. We have about $4 trillion in assets under management, over 10,000 companies in which we own. So racial and ethnic diversity, or DEI issues more generally, we see them as a business risk. So we're looking at business risks and opportunities, and also systemic risks and opportunities. So for us, this really is our responsibility as a fiduciary to be looking really closely at how companies and boards specifically are overseeing what we think is really a financially material risk, and also an opportunity. I love how Barry's commenting that it's so closely tied to strategy. The board is responsible for overseeing strategy, and DEI should be an integral part of such strategy. So we're really talking with the boards and the companies in which we're investing in, and try to understand where it fits within the company or within the board, what committees, how frequently is it discussed at board meetings. But certainly this is a financially material risk, not only within the organization of a company, but also the broader stakeholder community, the communities in which they're operating within, their customer base, and more from a systemic level, society as a whole.
Thanks. And so speaking of kind of the strategy and performance aspects, let's talk about the relationship of DEI and racial equity to strategy and performance. How should the board ensure that management incorporates this work into its overall business strategy? How should they go about it? Have you seen it done well anywhere? And any of you feel free to jump in and get started on this one.
Yeah, first it's about having a strategy, and we also appreciate that every strategy may look different. So we're not being prescriptive on telling companies what their strategy should be, but rather trying to understand what the strategic objectives of the business are, and how DEI practices fit into that. And I think, especially when you think about the importance of human capital management, and Mel's comments around corporate culture and the board's responsibility for overseeing management's execution of corporate culture, and what that strategy is, it's so closely tied together. One thing that is challenging, but I think is so important when developing such strategy is thinking about the KPIs or the indicators, or what the impact of the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and having the board monitor those KPIs and set targets and goals, I think is so important in the strategic planning process. And that's what we find is a key element when we're talking to companies that have a really robust strategy, a DEI strategy.
Yeah, I would build on what Benjamin is talking about. I mean, I think that the whole thing with D&I goals is that it has to be part of the company's values, part of the company's purpose, and part of the company's strategy. And obviously the place where it fits the best is in the talent strategy. And so it isn't just a conversation, and it's not just a report, it's actually what activities are happening in the company to make sure that that is happening. And I would just tell you that in the old days, which might be like 3 years ago, you might have a report on diversity, right? You might have the person who was in charge of diversity come and do a report. I think to make it work, and I can tell you in both my boards, we have made it a very important part of the talent committee, of the compensation and human capital committees, because it really has to go all the way into a pipe. It's, first of all, it's multidimensional, right? You got to be thinking about how do you retain your diverse talent, which, by the way, is in today, there is tremendous demand for diverse talent. So it's not a simple exercise. Second, how do you acquire diverse talent? What kind of activities do you do? For example, at Disney, we have a partnership with historically Black colleges and universities to actually recruit talent. And then how do you really create a sense of belonging inside of the company so that the sense of inclusion of your talent is such that it keeps growing? By the way, it starts with the board. It starts with who are your directors and are they diverse? And do they understand the importance of diversity and racial equity?
For a company, let me just follow up on that a little bit. So some companies are more adept and experienced at doing what you just described than others. For companies that haven't yet fully incorporated this DEI work into their talent strategy, what's the board's role in making sure that happens? How do you see the board interacting with management to make sure they move in the direction that you all have just articulated?
I can just tell you from my boards, I don't want to take up the airspace here, but it is first of all, it's an assignment in the committees. So whether it's around the talent and the pipeline that we have in terms of coming up the pipeline, or whether it's around pay equity, you have to make sure that these issues are really an important part of the committee structure. And then you have to make sure at the full board level that there is robust discussion on these issues, that the committee chairs bring that to the full board and there's robust discussion on these issues, which means you got to get it on the agenda for the board meetings.
Thank you.
It's about prioritizing and having a board that prioritizes this and sets, and ensures that it's communicated to executive management teams. And one of the mechanisms that we've seen be effective is incorporating it to executive compensation. I think it can be a useful tool. Not all ESG metrics. I don't think that it's always useful to include an executive compensation, but around DEI targets and goals, we've seen it be very effective, and not just as incentivizing the behavior, but also penalizing or holding back executive compensation when targets or goals have not been achieved. So both from a positive and a negative perspective. I've seen a really interesting executive compensation plan where the awards were based off of minority employees, employee engagement surveys, and ensuring that the gap between racial and ethnic groups as narrow as possible. And they had robust indicators of what the objectives and targets were, and it was something that was independently calculated, but it really it resonated with management team, and it was prioritized because it was such an integral part of the executive compensation program.
Thanks, Ben. And we're going to do the committees in just the next moment, but let me just follow up with Barry. Say, Barry, how as a board, how do you get management to move in the direction of incorporating DEI and racial equity in their talent strategy?
Well, there's so much that my fellow panelists said that I agree with, that because diversity is part of strategy and it's the board role to oversee strategy, that's just a natural part of the strategy discussions. And I think you have to make them accountable, so it should be tied to compensation. I just want to make a quick comment on my perspective of why boards are thinking about diversity more and more. And that is, I talk to as many fellow directors as I can about what's new in the boardroom post-pandemic, post this economic cycle. And the reason I say that, the best example is I'm on a hospital board, and we were going to move to digital visits. We had a 5-year plan. 2 months into the pandemic, we exceeded our 5-year plan. So we had to, we had to understand the business had changed. And if people were coming digitally to visits, maybe we didn't need all these fixed assets and what have you. It changed our whole strategy. And then when we found people were pretty much effective working at home, again, we needed to change our whole strategy around capital spending and what have you. So my point is, business is different going forward. We need as many diverse thoughts on what those strategies should be. And that's what I think is driving business. We've got to come up with new strategies, and diversity can help drive that process.
Let me move to what we might call the how question. So board structure and process around these initiatives. So how should the board organize its process around both workforce DEI and the company's other racial equity initiatives? Which committees should they have and which responsibilities? What gets kept at the full board level?
So maybe I should start out. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mel.
Oh, no, you go ahead, please, Barry.
No, but this sounds very much like the discussion we've been having the last couple of years about risk management. Should it be in a committee or should it be elevated to the board level? And my point of view is, if you want to prioritize something, you do it at the board level and get the CEO directly involved. So my belief is diversity eventually has to be a standing item in the board's agenda. And companies are different. I've seen diversity audit committee, public policy, nom and governance, compensation. Some of the work could be done at the committee level, but eventually, given its importance, it has to be a standing item at the board level, in my view.
Mel?
I was just going to say that there's a very different, I mean, every company is different, right? But I would say there's a very big difference between the level of granularity that you get at the committee level and the work required at the committee level and the work that's done by the full board. So in both my boards, this work is done at the committee level where we can really drill down into the hows, but then it is reported and put on the agenda at the full board level so we can have the discussion. So I think it tends to be in both. I think if you just leave it at the board level, you're going to get more reporting and less granularity. That's my sense from my boards, but every company is different and has to figure out how it fits into their process.
Okay. Ben, which committees, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, so in a report, you can see that, some companies have it in the audit committee, some in the comp committee, some in sustainability committees. But I'm really pleased to hear that both, Mel and Barry think that this is a full board issue. So absolutely, there's work that can be done at the committee level. We're agnostic to which committee it sits within, but we want explicit oversight from the full board. We want this to be on the full board agenda because, I mean, after all, the positive benefits of some of the positive benefits are that diversity in thought. And to really harvest that, it needs to be discussed at that, amongst all directors. And we've heard from, in our interviews with some directors that it's not always an easy conversation at the full board level. There is pushback, there is, differences of opinion, but I mean, I think that's those conversations need to happen. And that's something that we encourage companies to have, those conversations, regardless of what committee it's housed in. It needs to be at the full board level as well.
I just
George,
Let Mel go.
I have a personal bias about having it be in compensation and human capital management, however we want to call it, because I think it has to be related to your pipeline, related to your management development and management leadership, related to your recruiting strategy. And so I think that, when you're reviewing compensation, for example, and you're reviewing the next level of leadership, you got to be looking at it, from the perspective of racially diverse metrics. So I would have a hard time thinking, we at Coke, by the way, we had it in the Public Affairs Committee for a while. And we actually decided that we would do much more work and it would be much more integrated if we put it in human capital management and talent, just so we could connect.
Let's drill down in that just a little bit. So within what you've said, the Human Capital Talent Committee, but you also included compensation. Let me ask you.
Same one.
Okay, good. So should DEI be a component of a CEO pay and other executives pay and performance metrics? And if so, how is that done?
Actually, in both my companies, it is a component of executive, of not just CEO pay, but it goes much further down. And I think what's complicated is what metrics you use, right? So I'm just going to give you an example with Disney, where you have all these different businesses, right? So some of the metrics might be around retention. Some of it might be around recruitment. And some of it in the content space, for example, might be about putting racially diverse content, because that's a big part of our DEI strategy, is to put out there in the world stories that are diverse so that people can self-identify into a world that they call it a world of belonging. So it's not one dimension, it's not one metric. Even in the same company, you might have different metrics that you use, but yes, then you need to be able to compensate and make it part of the performance management and compensation for executives.
Barry, have you seen that?
Yes, and in the companies that I served on the board, I made sure that happened because, again, the way to get attention is to develop some metrics, even if they're not all quantitative, they can be qualitative. People will pay attention when it's a metric in their compensation. The point I would make, though, is I really think not only does it have to be in compensation, but it has to be within the direct metrics, not a modifier, some loose modifier that you put on at the last minute. It has to drive everyday performance. And George, I just want to make one more point about where diversity should be on a board. And that is, it's equally important to get CEO involvement. And I'll give a quick example. Over the last 6 or so years, because of age, term limits, what have you, I retired from 5 boards. I wanted to be replaced by a Black director. And that only happened in 2 of the 5 cases. And there are lots of reasons, and some very good, why it didn't happen in the others. I had the same amount of effort in all 5 cases, but the 2 that happened is because the CEO got directly involved and made that a priority. So not only should diversity be at the board level, but it's got to be in the CEO's responsibility.
I don't think any of this can happen without the CEO. I think he or she has to be the lead in all of this, strongly supported by the board. But if you don't have a CEO that believes in this, it's never going to happen.
Thank you. Let me check with you all about some other committees. Nomination and governance. What is their role in this work?
I think the most obvious is the recruitment of diverse directors.
Okay.
Right. Because that's where you're going to be able to get diversity at the board level. And I think you have to be very explicit, to Barry's point, when you're looking for directors, for new directors, that you want certain kind of representation.
Yeah,
okay.
For us, it's all about refining that nomination process itself and ensuring that there's a diverse set of candidates. We are holding NomGov committee accountable for meeting our expectations around diversity as well. In our research, one of the things I thought that was interesting is we didn't hear a lot about the onboarding process for new directors. I think it would be, I think DEI should be a part of the curriculum, so to speak, of the onboarding process of new directors in terms of training, in terms of thinking about it, or the education process for directors more generally, ensuring that there is a robust pipeline of talent also includes that educational part for new directors and also existing directors.
Okay, let me ask you whether there's any role for the audit committee. I've seen some reference to some companies having DEI and racial equity in the audit committee. Is that an appropriate place for this work, or how do you see it?
I think what's going to happen as D&I becomes more used in executive compensation, and as you have more and more disclosure in terms of what metrics you're using and how you're paying executives for that, you're going to be reporting that in your proxy. And I think the audit committee is probably going to make sure that they can basically inspect what they expect. That in fact, if we're putting out this disclosure, that is absolutely accurate.
Okay. Now, let me just circle back quickly to the full board. How often, within the year's worth of meetings, how often should the board be expecting to hear from management on this topic? Should every meeting? Is it once a year?
I would say at least once a year, depending on, what particular part is on the agenda. I would tell you recently in the last couple of years, I think in both my boards, it's come up at every meeting.
Okay, let's move into efforts to increase diversity on boards. I want to ask you all, what are the latest trends or innovative approaches you've seen? How should boards make themselves aware of a list of potential candidates, includes racially and ethnically diverse candidates from underrepresented groups? Let's just start there. What trends are you seeing, and how do boards make themselves aware of candidates from racially and ethnically diverse groups?
I would just, again, I don't want to be the the only one talking about this, but I do think that the major recruitment firms, whether it's Russell Reynolds or it's Egon Zehnder, all of the majors have actually board practices, and they've all started to have a focus on finding racially diverse candidates. So I think that expanding the universe of directors by going out to these firms and helping them find a slate of candidates that include racially diverse candidates is very useful. And I think they actually have much longer lists of racially diverse candidates today than, say, 5 years ago.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And not only is the pool of candidates larger, but also thinking about expertise outside of your own industry as well. If you're a healthcare company seeking a HR experience, or capital allocation experience, for example, it doesn't need to be specifically within your industry. I also think giving opportunities to first-time directors as well. So maybe changing the criteria from it needs to be a former CEO to giving a director of color their first opportunity on a board, I think is really important. Some of the innovative practices that we've heard from companies, as I mentioned, is incorporating it as an integral part of the onboarding process for new directors. Others have said that board chairs proactively empower directors of color to speak up. And for us, it's really about that critical mass of diverse directors. So not just having, to avoid any kind of tokenism, we're looking for, a critical mass. And that's really where the literature points towards of being where that value or that the benefits of diversity thought really come into play. So that's some of the trends that we're seeing. And I think one of the really important ones is really empowering not only the people of color, the diverse directors, but also empowering the CEO as well or the HR officers or the HR department to really take initiative and have this be a priority throughout the organization.
And Barry, you've been at this for many years, I know, trying to increase both the pipeline of potential board candidates and the actual getting people onto boards. What trends are you seeing in recent years compared to when you first started doing this work?
Well, George, this is what I spend all my time on, particularly trying to get people of color on public company boards. And certainly the spotlight shown on this issue by the George Floyd and related incidents has helped. What's really helped in my mind is the efforts of State Street and people like that, the mandates and what have you. You know, there's a dramatic increase in the number of minorities getting on boards in the last couple of years. I think that though that there are two great limitations that we have to address. You know, there are plenty of candidates, and you know, I'm working on identifying and helping various organizations work with each other. But I've identified over 20 organizations who are identifying minority candidates, and you know, we have a working list of over 800 that an experienced director would vouch for. So there's no shortage of supply. But the two limiting factors, and they were just referred to, one of them is board size, competition, composition, and what have you. We've got to get a better system of board rotation, because not that many board seats come up. And I am a believer that there's more than one diversity seat. So, and then the second thing is for all the wonderful work that I believe search firms are doing now, still the majority of searches are handled internally. And so how to get my candidates, my friends, to be your friends is a big issue. And we've got to figure out a way to expose this candidate pool to the decision makers. And you know, I'm a big believer in just what just said, that going forward, the skill sets needed to implement the new strategies are quite different. So corporations are going to have to do evaluation of the skill sets, the strategic needs. And I think they'll find that it's time to give several of their existing board members the golden watch and a handshake, and try to attract some new types of people.
Yeah, let me follow up a bit on this. So one of the things you're referencing is the fact that some incumbent board members, when they look into their networks of professional relationships, they don't have peers who are racially and ethnically diverse. So question is, how do you get them to have some of your friends be their friends? And then secondly, when does this process begin, or when should it begin at the board level of looking for candidates? Is it when they're on the cusp of a vacancy, or is it continuous? What are your views on when boards should be engaged in this activity?
Well, for both my boards, it's continuous, right? So, and we do in the Committee on Directors spell out the skills and the attributes we would be looking for new directors, whether it was industry knowledge, or it was racial diversity, or it was international expertise, or it was cybersecurity. I mean, we have an ongoing list that we are refining. And so we tend to cast our net long before we bring in a director. I would also want to say that about making your friends be the friends of the people on the board. If you have a diverse board, they have those friends. That's their network, or likely to be their network. So you're actually able to do that starting at the board level by having a diverse board.
George, I wanted to ask Mel, in my experience, a board search literally took at least a year. So we started a year and sometimes 2 years in advance. And also, before we had a specific need, we started to develop an inventory of candidates. Is that your similar experience?
Yes, absolutely. And it's moving all the time. You know, the candidate slate, there's people we're adding people or we're taking people off. But it's a continuous process. I can't think of a meeting at one of my boards that we have not updated to the director candidate list.
Okay.
But in my experience, no more than one board seat comes up every year or two. So, you know, it's not a rapid process to transform boards. Unless we make boards bigger, unless we have some sort of term limits, and we got to get some more rotation on boards.
I'm going to move us to the next topic, and that is these external forces outside of the company that are catalysts for change inside the company. And I'm talking about, you know, regulators, the SEC, for example, states like California, exchanges like NASDAQ, activist shareholders, institutional investors, investment banks, Goldman Sachs is an example, and even employee groups and customers. What are you seeing and feeling as being the effect of all of that activity on boards' attention to DEI and racial equity? Okay. Yeah,
So,
anybody can start.
well,
Yeah.
I'm going to say that I think, and I do congratulate State Street on this. I think for way too long, we did not have a way of hearing the voice of our majority shareholders around these issues. And I think that the rise of index funds and the assets in the index funds, which made the three big ones, including State Street, have such an outsized impact in terms of our ability to hear their voice. And so I think that their focus on these issues, whether it's about climate or DNI or any series of governance issues, I think have made a significant difference, because the board, we're fiduciaries for the shareholders. So it is our role to listen and to be able to represent them and represent their interests. And so I think that to me is by far the biggest impact and the most important one. And I, for one, I'm grateful for it.
Well, I don't want to make this a commercial for State Street, but I'll say this. In my work on diversity, it's easier to get willing followers than to find people who will step out and take the lead. State Street has stepped out and taken the lead, and I really commend them for doing that and taking a step forward. You know, personally, I hate mandates. I'll just say that up front. But what I say to my fellow business associates, shame on us for not identifying this issue and moving on it, so that we had to be in a position where now we have to respond to mandates. So now let's get on and move ahead. But it's really our fault that we have to resort to having mandates. So I welcome now mandates. They are causing the difference. You know, I talked about George Floyd. I think the George Floyd incidents did a great service, but I think what's really gotten the ball moving is these organizations that reflect shareholder values. And we're listening better to what our shareholders want.
And shareholders are raising their voice because this is, you know, a financially material risk and opportunity, because other stakeholders as well, whether it's customers or employees, take this seriously. It's important for talent retention. It's important for corporate culture. There is headline risks. There is systemic risks associated for it. So I think that it takes all stakeholders and not just shareholders. I think we've had a lot of impact because not only have we been clear on our expectations and being progressive on these issues, but also because we've have an accountability mechanism, which is that director vote. So using our voting power, whether it's supporting shareholder proposals or voting against directors and companies where we don't think we're making meaningful progress. I think that's obviously been had a lot of impact. One of the stakeholders that I think that you referenced as well was activist shareholders. And I think it's a really interesting concept. We try to be as clear as we can with our expectations. We want companies to meet those expectations because we think it's in their best long-term interest. We've seen increasingly have activists been using this as a weaponizing kind of DEI, whether it's in their pitch deck of the company's DEI practices, or also the candidates in which they're putting forward at proxy contests, for example. We're analyzing proxy contests based off of strategy and ensuring that there's directors are appropriately suited with expertise to execute on a strategy or oversee that strategy. But we're definitely seeing that more frequently are activists using this kind of as a tool to garner institutional support.
Then let me get a clarification from you on what the situation is, and then I want to ask you how State Street is reacting to this. So you're seeing activists as part of their strategy for getting the company to move in whatever direction they want, raising the issue of DEI and the company's efforts at racial equity. Are you seeing that used in a sincere and good faith way, or are you use the term weaponized, or are you seeing it used as a tactic? And when you answer that, also I'd be interested in whether State Street has an approach to how it evaluates those kinds of tactics.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able. I mean, the sincerity, it's going to be case by case. I think, but the outcome, if there is improved DEI practices, if there is an increased incentive for boards to proactively be thinking about the composition of their boards, I think it's a positive outcome. When we're analyzing a situation, absolutely sincerity is one of the elements. We look at track record. So what is the activist track record, for example, or what is the authenticity of the company as well? Have we had solid engagements with directors for many years? Have there been genuine efforts to think about DEI issues, or has the board appropriately had oversight? And we also want to acknowledge this is a journey. Not every company is where no company is where they want to be in this journey. We've seen companies proactively come to us and say, this is our employee engagement amongst our Black employees specifically is well below our other employee groups. And this is an issue, and here's how we're going about rectifying the issue, and here's our strategy for improving employee engagement amongst our Black employees for this in this example of company engagement. And we were open-minded. We were happy to see that the company was taking initiative and that they were being transparent with investors. So that kind of track record of genuine efforts to improve DEI is something that we think about, especially in a proxy contest. But ultimately, it's about strategy. We won't just make a voting decision just solely based off of an ESG issue. But because DEI is so closely related to strategy, it is an element of the decision making.
I'm going to move along.
George, can I just make a point here? And I like to put the dot on the I. This is not a criticism. So much of our conversation has been on the human resource people side when we talk about diversity. I just want to make sure, and I think my fellow panelists agree, that we also have to look at all aspects of diversity and how it impacts our community. So where I think we need to get is not only disclosures on diversity, but we need to but we need to get diversity in procurement, diversity in philanthropy, because these are all instruments of how corporations impact our communities.
Yeah,
Totally agree.
yeah, thanks for raising that, Barry. I'm going to try to move us along to our next two topics. Coming back to State Street, let's talk. I'd like to talk about your tell us what was State Street's proxy guidance for last year, for 2021, on gender, racial, and ethnic diversity, and whether you were able to measure an effect of that guidance. Can we just start there? You're on mute, I think.
Yep. Sorry about that. It is a long process in terms of recruiting directors, or this is a journey. So we try to be as transparent as we can with our expectations and give companies time to meet those. In August 2020, we announced we published our expectations, and that was we wanted companies to have diverse representation on the board, to be disclosing the actually information, self-identified demographic information about their directors, because that wasn't really common at the time. We wanted companies to publish their metrics and goals and targets, including the EEO1 information. There are some challenges with the EEO1, but we think it's baseline disclosure. And we also want to see the strategy related to DEI and how the board is overseeing such strategy. Later that year, or at the beginning of 2021, we announced that we were going to start voting against companies, the chair of the compensation committee specifically, for companies that didn't disclose their EEO1 data at a minimum. And we started implementing those voting guidelines this year. We also announced that we would be voting against the chair of the Nom/Gov committee for companies that aren't disclosing the composition of their board, the racial and ethnic composition of their board. And starting this year, we started voting against companies in the US and the UK if they didn't have at least one director from an underrepresented community. And that's a step in the direction. What we're trying to get after is diversity in thought. Racial and ethnic diversity at board level is just one dimension. As you mentioned, we also implemented voting guidelines on gender diversity, and that was our Fearless Girl campaign. We placed the statue, down in Wall Street in 2017, and that was in tandem with our voting guidelines, where we started voting against companies that didn't have at least one female director on the board. The impact has been significant. I don't think there are no more companies in the S&P 500 that do not have at least one woman on their board to date. And now we've announced revised voting guidelines this year. We're requiring 30% female representation in addition to the one director from an underrepresented community. On the EEO1 side, just quickly, the impact was when we announced that we wanted to see that information, 4% of the Russell 3000 were reporting that information, and now it's around 50% of the S&P 500 and around 30 or 40% of the Russell 3000 last time I checked. So it's been significant in the last year of the number of companies that have disclosed in alignment with our expectations.
Good, thanks for that explanation. Mel and Barry, I want to ask you, one of the points that Ben just made is that they're moving up from their desire to have at least one director to having 30% of the directors be from underrepresented groups, gender or race. Does it make a difference in your view whether there's one person on the board or several?
I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah, and what
I remember when I was the only woman on the board, and now that in both my boards there's 4 or 5 of us, it makes a huge difference.
And can you explain a little bit about how that plays out?
When you're the only one on the board, and I can tell you this particular with women, you might make a point and it's almost like you weren't heard. When there's several of you on the board and one of you makes a point, there often is a repeat of the point, but from a different perspective from another one of the members of the board. And it makes sure that your voice is heard. And I've seen that over and over again. So whatever it is, whatever the point is, it doesn't get as ignored or passed over as it might have in the past.
Okay, thank you. Barry, have you had experience of being either the only one or or the counter to that being one of several? And what's the difference in your experience?
I think I started board service in 1982. So I've not only been the only minority on the board, I've been often the first minority on a board, and only in a few boards where there are multiple minorities. Regardless of the issue, regardless of whether you're a minority, the most effective way to get something done on a board is to have collaboration with other board members. And so certainly I feel that the more the merrier of minorities on a board. As I stated before, I'm not a believer there's only one diversity seat. So, and I think boards will benefit from having more minorities and different points of view, because even within the minority community, you're going to have diversity of views.
Thanks for those comments. Ben, I'd like to circle back to State Street's recent report, which I indicated earlier is entitled "The Board's Oversight of Racial and Ethnic Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion." I'd like to start by asking you, what was the impetus for State Street undertaking the creation of this report, along with Russell Reynolds Associates and the Ford Foundation?
Yeah, and you know, we launched a initiative at State Street called the 10 Actions to Address Racial and Ethnic Diversity, and this was in response to the tragic killing of George Floyd, and it was a State Street Corporation initiative where we went out to try to understand what is, from an asset manager perspective, what is our expectation of companies? Where does the responsibility lie? Is it the board's responsibility, in general, to oversee such risks and opportunities? And if so, what is in scope for their responsibilities? So we went out and we spoke with Russell Reynolds and Ford Foundation, and were able to partner with them, and we interviewed around 25 directors from that were sitting on multiple companies and in many jurisdictions as well, and to really dig deep into these issues. So it was also to take it back to State Street Corporation and learn from what we heard from directors, to understand what best practices were, to also incorporate it into our own practices as an organization.
Thanks for that. So tell me, you had, it's a wonderful report. I could have used it to kind of outline this entire program. But tell me, there was an executive summary where there were 5 kind of major points that you made. Can you review those for the audience? Sure. The first was, what motivates boards oversight. One of the things that we heard a lot was that this was about the right thing to do from directors. For us, it's about value and not our values, but from many of the directors we interviewed, they weren't citing the potential economic impacts of racial inequality as a key motivator. It was more that this was the right thing to do. So we heard that a lot. Oversight and practice, just a lot of what we talked about in terms of committee structures, where it belongs, how companies are thinking about it in best practices. Where both boards are focusing their attention as well, not just the workforce, but beyond that, and thinking about the philanthropic efforts, their procurement processes. That's really interesting. Metrics and performance management, which I think is absolutely key. It's also difficult to quantify, especially thinking about DEI as not a singular term, but diversity means one thing, equity means another, and inclusion. So how do you ensure that that is being fostered in practice? And the last one was challenges in a global context. Diversity means very different things and very different in different geographies, in different regions. So multinational companies specifically face particular challenges when they're thinking about these issues and reporting to shareholders. Okay. Let me just ask Mel and Barry a couple of follow-ups to that. On this issue of multinational corporations and diversity, what are some of the challenges and how are companies thinking about this issue?
I think it's got to be defined within the context of that particular geography. So for example, we know about what D&I means in the US, But for example, in Japan, it might be about age. It might be about the fact that, you don't have enough young people in the organization. So I think that it depends. You have to do it within the context. And so it has to be locally, the metrics and the targets have to be locally generated to be sure that it's consistent with whatever's going on in the context of that country.
Would that geographic focus also be done inside the United States, that in different regions or different product groups or sectors or business sectors? Is
Well,
that?
George, I'm glad you raised that. I'm in Silicon Valley, and we have to have a more expanded definition of minorities because of the realities of our workforce. And, we have such a large percentage of our population that they are first or less generation born here. And we have quite a population around the world, which I would still consider minority. So yes, we have to have a flexibility in the definition of minorities.
Okay, and then Ben, back to you. Your report also, as a result of your work, State Street came up with some 10 points of guidance, takeaways from the work. Can you tell us of the 10, what are 3 to 5 key ones that you'd like people to be aware of?
Yeah, and I think we touched on some of this. First of all, it's just prioritizing, make sure that the CEO and the board chairs are prioritizing the issue. And I really was happy to hear that the panelists think this is a full board issue, because I think that that's absolutely key. One of the things that we didn't hear a lot in the discussions, that we took away as an important area to think about, and maybe a blind spot, is including the perspectives of other stakeholders, specifically employees, in board discussions. So that employee voice, getting that channel and the mechanism to hear your employees and other key stakeholders, I think is really important, because you can learn a lot, and you can also identify risks and hotspots within the organization, especially when it comes to DEI risks and opportunities. And the last thing I think is so key is that it's a journey, that this is a long process, but it's one that we need to take initiative now, but we have to be patient with companies. We have to be understanding that companies are not exactly where they want to be, and that when the disclosure comes out, if it's linked to a tangible roadmap, and there are goals and there is prioritization, that we are willing to work with companies and not and to be patient with them, because we do understand that this is going to take time.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, I remember one of the points of your 10 points had to do with whether companies should be focusing on the impact of the company's operations on the communities that they intersect with. Can you talk a little bit more about that one?
Yeah, no, I think it's and Mel talks about this a lot as well. And I, when you are operating in a community, whether it's attracting and retaining talent, or it's your consumer base, or there is the systemic risks that you may create. I think it's incredibly important for boards to consider that, and it should be part of the strategy. And I know that in the prep call, Mel was talking about this being an integral part of Coke strategy, for example. Or so I think it's really interesting, and it's really enlightening for me to hear that, because I think that every company is going to have a different strategy when it comes to DEI, but certainly your consumer base or the communities in which you're operating in need to be a key component of that.
All right, that's going to be the end of our main conversation. And now I'd like to look at a few of the questions we've received. And
George, could I just, one parting remark?
Sure.
I would hope that we set up a system so that we can monitor and measure all these individual efforts. I mean, it's been a couple of years now since California had its initiatives on women and things like that. I lack an understanding of what has been the impact. So I just in our planning efforts, let's make sure we have some monitoring system to measure all this.
Excellent point. So there was one question in the chat that asked about what on the issue of metrics and measurement. Kind of the general question is what should boards be asking from management about metrics? Like, what are the metrics? What should they be looking at?
Well, you know, again, I think it depends on the company to have an aspiration. For example, Coke has an aspiration that by 2030, at least half of our leadership positions will be run by women. So how do you get from here to there, right? And so you have an aspiration, and then I think you have to back up from there and figure out, okay, what are all the different things that we need to do, whether it's around the pipeline, whether it's around recruitment, whether it's around retention, whether it's about the management development, to be able to get there, you know, by 2030. And so I think it's really important for companies to put out a very specific aspiration that is important to their business. And as State Street always says, material, right? And then be able to back up and say, well, how do we get from here to there? What are the right metrics to make sure that we're on the glide path?
Okay, thank you for that. So another question along the lines of what do you do when it feels like there's more talk than action? So the question is that, you know, the company appears to be doing the right things, but sometimes the various pronouncements by the company feel more like talk than actual actions. And so let's focus on the board level. Do you run into other board members who sometimes feel that way, that there's a lot of talk and not action? Or the other side of that, how should the board make sure that something's actually happening meaningfully with management's activity, as opposed to a lot of activity that doesn't move the company forward?
Again, I think that's reporting on whether or not we're moving the needle and whether or not we're on the glide path in terms of what our aspiration is around specific activities.
I really liked Mel's description of having an aspiration, because then you could see if you're making progress or not. And
okay. Let me ask, because we didn't get to it in the main session, two of you have been lead independent directors. So maybe starting with you, Mel, what are your responsibilities with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the company's racial equity efforts as a lead independent director, as opposed to, you know, the other directors? How do you feel your responsibility is different, and how should people understand that role?
Well, I think that one of the responsibilities of the lead independent director is to set the agenda for the board meetings, and together with the chair, right? And so I think one of the biggest things is actually making sure that these issues are on the agenda for the board and are discussed at the board, and there's feedback afterwards as to whether, you know, to the CEO and the chair as to whether we're really making progress or not, and what we need to do differently.
Okay, and Barry, what's been
my experience is exactly like Mel's, that you know, one of your major responsibilities is to help set that agenda, and you know, it's your role to make sure issues like diversity are correctly on the agenda, periodically on the agenda. You have tremendous influence.
Okay. There's another question along the lines of whether there's a CEO who just is not engaged or as interested in pursuing DEI and corporate level racial equity initiatives consistent with what we've been talking about in this seminar. And the question comes from the perspective of the management below the CEO who does want to do those things. How does the board, because I want to keep this focus on the board's role, how does the board understand whether they have a CEO that is resistant to moving forward? And what should the board do if they recognize that their CEO is not someone who's fully committed to DEI growth and advancement?
I think you can tell. It's not a surprise. You know, I mean, it's not going to be a secret. And if it's not important to the CEO, and the board thinks it's important to the company, then you got to change the CEO.
Easier said than done, but
No, but one of the things that a board does with the CEO is review his priorities. And if they're missing, the board has the right and responsibility to add things to his priorities. And bottom line is, if he doesn't accept them, then you got to make a move.
okay. Ben, do you have thoughts on how boards should?
You know, I think that's where the importance of having clear and established KPIs, prioritizing it from the board, having KPIs, if appropriate, tying to executive compensation. That's a good way to incentivize behavior.
Okay. There's another question about how company size should be taken into account with respect to everything we've been talking about. And the question was framed as the difference between, say, S&P 500 companies versus Russell 3000. Maybe, Ben, can you talk about how State Street views the issue that we've been talking about, DEI and racial equity initiatives, across the spectrum of companies and industries and size of companies and the like?
Yeah. So you know, we think it's a financially material issue for all companies, regardless of size, regardless of sector. But we have seen that, you know, some of the larger companies have been more progressive on this issue. Also from a reporting standpoint, you know, it could be there's obviously a bias, you know, a market cap bias of quality of reporting. Maybe larger sustainability teams, maybe more focused from institutional investors, or but we have seen that, you know, the disclosure does improve. And generally speaking, ESG practices, you know, are better with larger companies. What I'm also interested in, because I know that the second half of this agenda is private equity firms. We don't have as much information on the boards or the employee bases of private firms. I would be interested to see the impact that you know, the public disclosure has had in improving practices relative to private companies or those held with it by private equity. So you know, as more information gets available, I know there's initiatives to improve disclosure in private equity or private companies. So I would be really interested to see not just the differences in size, but differences in ownership structure.
Okay. Let me ask about your sense of how your peers, your other board members, think about the economics of the company's activity around racial equity and DEI. Do some see it as a burden, a cost only? Do some see it as an opportunity? What is your sense of the range of views among you know, your peer board members over the years and currently, without revealing, of course, any specifics for any specific company?
I don't think everybody's in the same place or gives it the same amount of importance. And so I do think that part of the role of the lead director is actually to try to help them get there if they're not there in a way that is consistent with what they think is important.
And
Well, I agree with Mel, and that's also why I consistently try to hammer diversity as a strategy business question. Because I'm trying to put it in terms that other business people can respond to. And you can have different views on social issues, but I find recharacterizing it as a business issue, a mandate issue, I've had more success that way. But yes, there's a variety of views.
To me, the most impactful is whether your CEO, if it's a CEO that has lots of credibility with the board, if this is important to him, it's going to become more important to the board. And I should have said if this is important to him or her, then it becomes more important to the board. And so leadership at the management level is absolutely critical to get everyone on the board understanding the importance.
okay, for the colleagues that you have that and have had over the years that are more resistant, can you give us a flavor of the nature of the difference? Do they think, for example, that it's not really a business issue and that it's more of a culture issue? Or are they just not sold on the business merits of it, as Barry has argued? What do you sense is the nature of the resistance?
I would say it's that, George. That is, they haven't really seen it as a key part of the strategy of the success of the company.
And I think if you asked historically, I think there was the thought that promoting diversity meant a diminution of quality. And I think we've hammered at that issue to say that we're not talking about lowering quality.
Yeah. And I mean, when you hear one of the things that we hear from companies that sometimes is it's like we want to put the best director on the board. It's just when you ask for enhanced representation. Well, we want the best directors on the board as well, but best director doesn't imply that it's a white male. It's changing the perspective that you can find very, very cool. We want great directors on the board as well, but it doesn't. There is a bias that needs to be broken down in certain circumstances where quality director does not have to be associated with a specific gender or a specific race, that you actually are looking at diverse sets of candidates and really embracing this idea of diversity in thought.
Thank you. And our time is just about up here. And so I want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion. I appreciate your willingness to be here with us and talk about these important issues. Now I'm going to turn the program over to our next session, and that's going to be the fireside chat with Professor Lisa Fairfax, interviewing Joseph Bay, the co-CEO of KKR. So I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank all of the audience members for participating and sticking with us.